Long ball football is back, baby. It's good again. Woo! Now, long ball football has generally had quite a bad rap because when people think of long ball football, what they think about is teams who are unable to build through the thirds, get the ball into dangerous areas, and so instead they just yeet the ball long and hope that one of their strikers can run through to it. But in the last few seasons, what we've started to see is actually some of the elite teams are using long ball football as well. So on the board in front of me here, I've got some data from Edison. So this is his data from last season, and what we've got here is his launched pass attempts here per 90 minutes. Now, a launched pass is any pass that goes over 40 yards. And as we can see last season, Edison's putting up around 7.51 launched passes per 90 in the Premier League. But if we look at the data from this season's opener against Burnley, we can see that Edison actually attempted 22 launched passes, which is obviously much more. On top of that, if we look at his average pass length last season, it was around 28 yards. And in the game against Burnley, that's gone up to 31.5 yards. And so Edison is actually kicking the ball further this season and kicking the ball further more often than he was last season. And there's another stat here that I think is actually quite interesting, because if we look at his launched pass completion rate, we can see that last season he was averaging a completion rate of around 44.5%. Now this season against Burnley, it was up at 54.5%. So it's clear that something has changed here, which is making hitting the ball long less risky. So the big question is, why are the elite teams happier to hit the ball long? And in order to understand that, we need to talk a little bit about pressing. I love talking about pressing. Now, in the last few decades, the received wisdom has been that if you're playing against a team that are much better than you, the best way of defending against them is to sit deeper. The reason you do that is because it just protects space around your own goal, makes it harder for the opposition to break down. But that does come at a cost, because what you're essentially saying is that you're not going to engage the opposition defensively until they reach around the halfway line. So you're allowing them the ball in this part of the pitch, you're allowing them to progress the ball down the pitch, and often what can happen in these sorts of situations, if you're playing against a really good team, is that they can just slowly force your back line really deep like this, and then just put you under a barrage of chances. And when you have strikers of the levels of some of the elite teams, then it's inevitable that eventually they're going to score. And so what we've started seeing in more recent seasons is that even some of the smaller teams are now happy to push higher up the field in a bid to disrupt the opposition build-up. And often what will happen is that those teams will go player for player in certain phases, because when you go player for player, it becomes very hard for oppositions to build up. So if the ball comes out to the centre-back here and all of the available options are being marked, it actually makes it very hard for you to move the ball down the field. Now, obviously this comes at a cost to the pressing team as well, because on the one hand, you're allowing a huge amount of space in behind, which can be found just through an intelligent long ball and a striker running on. And as well as this, if you do end up going player for player across the field, what can happen is that if you're pushing all your players up onto available free players, you end up with these isolated 1v1s in the back line. And again, those are quite exploitable through balls over the top as well, especially when you're up against a team who will have a really elite front line. So what we're seeing more and more is that some teams will use a hybrid approach. So they'll have phases of play where they're going to go really aggressive up against the opposition's deep build-up. They'll try and go player for player in certain situations. It may be on one side of the pitch or the other, but the general idea is to disrupt that build-up. But if the press gets broken, then they're going to have a system where they're able to fall back into a nice, neat, consistent block where they're going to stop the opposition from having space. So certain phases of the play, you push high. In other phases, you're dropping deep, and that's where pressing has got us in the modern day. And so what we'll see on the field is the pressing team sitting in a sort of in-between phase where they're ready to jump forward player for player should certain conditions arise, but they're also ready to jump back as well. And as soon as you have this situation where teams are either going to go one way or the other, there's going to be the possibility of manipulating them and generating weaknesses. So let's just have a look at one example of how that might happen. So let's imagine that the red team here are trying to build out and get into this space that has been opened up. The goalkeeper is going to play it to the centre-back. The blue team have a front three, which they're going to try and go player for player. So the ball's gone on this side, so they're all going to shift across this way, because that means that you're covering the fullback on the near side. Now, obviously, that is opening up a weakness on this side of the pitch, which could be found through a good pass. So to avoid this, the blue team are going to jump their fullback right up onto the opposition fullback to avoid that weakness opening up here. Now, we can see here the wide forward for the red team is free. So let's say the centre-back covers here, and then the other centre-back is just going 1v1 against the opposition striker. Now, you may notice that this has opened up a 3v3 matchup on the back line, and this could be exploited through the use of a long ball, as we've said. But in this situation, it's not a hugely worrying scenario, because as you can see, the centre-back has the ball in their own half. They're being put under pressure by an opponent player, so it would be unlikely that they would be able to find a really incisive ball from there. But there's also the possibility that a really good team in possession could bounce the ball around the opposition press and get it into this sort of situation where suddenly this is looking a lot more dangerous when you've got 1v1 matchups all across the back line. And so this approach to out of possession football is forcing teams in possession to think about where the weaknesses lie as these teams are trying to shift between different shapes and opening up weaknesses in their own structure. So that's the theory. What does it look like in practice? Well, to give you an example of that, what I want to do is go to the season opener that we saw between Manchester City and Burnley. Now, Burnley are a newly promoted side. They're playing against Manchester City, who won the league last season. But rather than sitting back in a deep block and allowing Manchester City to control the game, actually what we saw from Burnley was a really aggressive out of possession system, where in certain phases they're going to attack player to player, and then in other phases they're going to drop back into a bit more of a block. Now, at first glance, this looks a little bit messy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw some lines on the field just to show you how the general structure is working out. So we've got a back five here, then a midfield two, Josh Cullen and Sander Berge, and then we have a front three here. So this is roughly speaking a 5-2-3 shape. Now, for the most part, Burnley are adopting a man marking system. So as you can see across their back line, they're matching player for player across Manchester City's front five. Elsewhere on the field, there are other fairly tight man marking responsibilities, but in this area of the pitch, we actually see a little bit of flexibility. And this is all to do with Burnley wanting to cause problems for Manchester City in their build-up. So the idea here is that there's a couple of players who are going to be quite flexible. They're going to sit between two opposition players and move between them depending on where the ball is. So it starts at the front with Amdouni, who's going to sit around Rodri and Akanji, and is also going to be at times responsible for jumping onto the goalkeeper, although Burnley were quite reticent jumping onto the goalkeeper for reasons that we'll talk about in a minute. But the mechanics here is that if Amdouni pushes forward, obviously Rodri's free, so Cullen will push onto him, but there's going to be certain situations where Amdouni can drop onto Rodri, leaving Cullen to be a little bit more flexible, presumably because De Bruyne is in this area, so they want to have the potential for double coverage on De Bruyne as well. And so as I look at it, there's two potential weaknesses here in Burnley's out of possession system that Manchester City can attack. The first one is this area here, as we've talked about, where there's a little bit of flexibility between marking responsibilities. And so if you do manage to pull one player forward, then maybe a player in behind them in the space who can then exploit that space. The other weakness is that when you're going player for player on the back line, you can actually manipulate the opposition structure quite considerably. We've already talked about how if De Bruyne goes forward, O'Shea is going to follow him, and that's going to create space in this kind of area here. But it is worth noting here that Burnley's aggressive man marking is restricted to two vertical zones. So when De Bruyne drops in, O'Shea will follow him. But there were certain situations in the match where De Bruyne would come across here, and rather than O'Shea coming all the way across to follow him, what would happen is he would drop back into his zone. And so what should theoretically happen is that everyone shifts across so that you're covering in this way as well. But obviously this is still generating space in the opposition back line. But the idea is that actually this is a zonal system in terms of the man marking, but as soon as someone's in your zone, then you aggressively man mark them there. But Pep Guardiola has a big, wet brain, and he applied that brain to this situation. And what he's going to do here, he's going to find those weaknesses in the opposition's defensive structure and try and pull them apart. So Manchester City come out and they're playing their standard 3-2-5 shape. And so as you'll notice, a front five against a back five is going to cancel itself out. Usually what Pep tries to do is to attack the channels between the opposition defenders. And so what he did in this situation was to actually make a front six. He did that by moving everyone across here, pulling Vitinho O'Shea across, and then pushing Walker down the line. So now you have 6 on 5 here. Now, that means you're taking a player out of your build-up structure, but that is fine to do when you have Ederson in your team, because what you can do is you can play Ederson as a central centre-back in the build-up. You've still got your 3-2 shape here, but now you have 6 players on the front line. And this obviously causes structural problems, because if you have a player like Lyle Foster in the wide area, he then has to sit in between both Akanji and Walker and try and decide which one he's going to mark. And so already we're seeing City trying to pull the structure around. But Burnley's press was still causing problems for Manchester City in their build-up, and so they weren't able to exploit this last line advantage. And so what Guardiola does is he finds a structural tweak in the middle to actually try and pull apart that press as well. And that structural tweak was that he went to a diamond midfield. And so we've seen Rico Lewis actually inverting, forming a pivot alongside Rodri. Actually, what we started seeing was him pushing into this sort of area now. Rodri dropping in to cover as the pivot, De Bruyne dropping out, and then Alvarez coming as the tip of the diamond. And so with Walker moving back into the first line of build-up, we can see that there's a 3-diamond-3 shape. Here's your diamond, and then you've got your front 3 and your back 3 here, with Ederson obviously forming a part of that build-up line as well. Why is this an issue? Well, now you have an overload in the central space. Who's marking who? We've already said that Amdouni is sitting between Akanji and Rodri, and Cullen was supposed to be sitting between Rodri and De Bruyne. That's all been pulled out of place. Alvarez has now come inside, so Alderweireld is coming more central, which is generating more space as well. And then Lewis before was sitting in the middle. He's now out here, and so he's causing problems to Berge and Koleosho as well. So by moving the structure around, you're actually causing much more problems for Burnley's press. Now, at some point in the first half, Kevin De Bruyne gets injured and is replaced by Mateo Kovacic. But Pep Guardiola is still not happy, and so he switches things up again before half-time, and that switch is that he moves Rico Lewis from being an inverted fullback to just being a classic fullback. And the reason that he does that is because it's going to allow Manchester City to cause even more problems for the Burnley shape. What we saw was actually a bit of a personnel shift as well. So we saw Foden switch sides, but actually come much narrower. Silva's going to come inside, and we're going to play Alvarez as an outside forward as well. But the point is that these wide forwards are actually going to sit really narrow. They're going to try and occupy the outside centre-backs in the back three. You've now got a 3v3 in this kind of area. And this raises questions for Vincent Kompany about what he's going to do with his wing-backs. On the left-hand side, Vitinho can just step up on Walker. That means that Foster can come inside onto Akanji and keep him covered here. But on the other side, it was a little bit different, because rather than having Amdouni sitting on the pivot player, Rodri here, he moved him out onto the other outside centre-back. And that means that Koleosho actually has to move across onto the full-back here. And so rather than Roberts moving up onto Lewis, he actually moves inside, so they've got coverage in the middle as well. So what we're seeing here across the first 45 minutes of the game is Pep Guardiola trying to find an advantage by pulling Burnley around, and this is the final form of that advantage. This is what he's going to go with, but he's going to make another tweak at half-time just to really hammer this advantage home. So what did Pep Guardiola say to his team at half-time? Well, we don't know, but what we do have is a quote from another game last season against Brighton and Hove Albion, which actually sees a similar tactical instruction take place. So this is a quote from Bernardo Silva talking to Sam Lee of The Athletic. He said, "We knew that Brighton could do man-to-man, but we weren't expecting it, to be honest. And then after 5 minutes, we realised that they would follow us everywhere, especially in the middle." So similar from what we saw from Burnley against Manchester City on the opening weekend. What did Pep Guardiola do? Well, the tactical change was getting Bernardo Silva closer to Rodri to create more space in between the lines for Erling Haaland. And the outcome of that is that there is more space up front for the players there to run into. So this is all about getting Erling Haaland into these situations where he's going to get an upside from players playing long balls. What did this look like against Burnley? Well, it was just a simple shift. It was just getting players further away from the front line, pulling their markers with them, and then suddenly look at the amount of space that you've generated here. We've got a 3v3 against Burnley's back three, and that's just going to allow you to just play the ball long over the top. So the difference between the first half and the second half is quite stark. So this is right at the beginning of the game, the first half. As you can see, Man City have a really wide front three, and as you can see, Burnley have done a really good job of getting a decent amount of coverage against that back line, and they're going to be able to cause problems for Man City in that build-up phase because they've got a lot of central compaction. Fast forward 45 minutes, and this is the second half, so now Man City are playing this way down the field. As you can see, you've got the wide fullbacks here, attracting players towards them. We've got the 2-8s here dropping in quite deep, pulling players with them, and that leaves a huge amount of space in this area here where we've got a 3v3. We have three world-class strikers up against three defenders, and that means it's going to encourage you to play long balls. And that is what the data shows. So this is Ederson's passing against Burnley. We can see he is playing a lot of long passes in the first half. A lot of them don't turn out to be that successful, but actually what we can see in the second half, as we can see, there's a lot more central long passing from Ederson here, and actually the success rate in this area in particular is quite high. You can see these successful passes coming up. One of these passes actually led to Erling Haaland being pulled down for the free kick, which led to the third goal as well. So you can see a very clear line between playing the ball long, winning a free kick and getting a goal from it. So long ball football is back, baby, and it's back not as a way of relieving pressure in your build-up, but actually creating pressure against opponents' back lines. Because of the way that oppositions are doing their out of possession stuff, you can actually generate weaknesses across the back line, and what we're starting to see from the elite teams is them finding ways to really exploit that and generate more goals.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.